This video will be focusing about cognitive load theory and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Both are theories of how people learn, focusing on the best ways to allow people to learn information efficiently. I sort of think of both of them as a form of educational engineering. We'll start with a description of cognitive load theory. Cognitive load theory is a theory of learning that focuses on the limitations of our working memory. Working memory is the process by which our brains consciously process information. The key idea with working memory is that humans can only process 2 to 4 elements at one time. This limits the number of new things that can be presented to learners at one time. What can expand this limit is if any of these elements are already stored in long-term memory. So in designing lessons, it's very important to consider both how much information is being presented, along with what is already known. One of the most important ideas from cognitive load theory is how intrinsic load and extraneous load affect the ability to learn. Intrinsic cognitive load is the information that is intended to be taught by the lesson. So intrinsic load includes all the outcomes that we want from a specific part of the lesson. Extraneous cognitive load is caused by non-essential parts that end up taking up parts of the working memory, so they cannot be used to process the intrinsic cognitive load. Intrinsic cognitive load and extraneous cognitive load together should not exceed the capabilities of the working memory of the individual trying to learn, otherwise learning will be impacted negatively. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning is the idea that people have 2 channels for learning information, one for visual materials and one for verbal material. Each of these channels has limited capacity to process information. However, the idea that more can be learned when both of these channels are being used than when only one is being engaged, and to use those 2 channels efficiently is the core of multimedia learning. Simply, people learn better from words and pictures than when only words are used. There are 3 main assumptions of the theory of multimedia learning: the dual channel assumption, the limited capacity assumption, and the active processing assumption. Dual channel assumption is that people have different channels for processing words and images. The limited capacity assumption is that there's a cap on the amount of information that can be processed in the word and image channels of the brain respectively. The active processing assumption is that there are 3 processes that humans use to learn: paying attention to relevant information, organizing the information, and integrating the information with prior knowledge. There are 3 memory stores that are described in the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. They are sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Sensory memory can hold an unlimited amount of visual and auditory signals, but only for a short amount of time. Working memory is for manipulating selected information and has a very limited capacity, and again can hold information for a short amount of time. Long-term memory permanently stores information and has virtually unlimited storage, but cannot be put there immediately. The way these types of memory interact informs us about how we can get the desired learning outcomes in multimedia learning. There are 5 processes within the brain that are important to multimedia learning, and those are selecting words, selecting images, organizing words, organizing images, and integrating. Selecting words and images mean that the learner is focusing on the words or images to transfer the relevant information into working memory. Organizing words and images means manipulating the information transferred to working memory in the selecting step into something coherent within working memory. The last process is integrating, and that means building connections between the models created in working memory in the organizing step and with prior knowledge. The last major part of the cognitive load theory of multimedia learning are the 3 demands of cognitive capacity, and those are extraneous processing, essential processing, and generative processing. Extraneous processing is the cognitive processing that is not related to the material that is intended to be taught. Essential processing is cognitive processing related to the material that is trying to be taught. Generative processing is the processing that is related to making sense of the information that is presented. It is important when designing lessons to try to manage generative and essential processing and minimize extraneous processing. Cognitive load theory and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning are both related theories of learning that do have some overlap. Cognitive load theory is a more general theory of education, whereas the cognitive theory of multimedia learning is more about one specific type of learning. The overlap between the two mostly comes into play when we think about the limits imposed by the brain about how much information humans can take in at one time. These similarities show up in the demands of cognitive capacity from the cognitive load theory of multimedia learning and the different types of cognitive load from the cognitive load theory.